First, I'd like to thank Deborah and ACT, the University of Simon Fraser, and the City of Vancouver for the invitation, the opportunity to say a few words to you in the 10-minute period assigned, which I will interpret in good Latin American fashion as being 15. The opportunity to return to Vancouver. I've only been here once before, which was in 1976 on the occasion of the UN Habitat Conference, which was celebrated here in a wonderful wooden structure under the effects of a very cold spell which happened to enter the city exactly when the meeting was held and had all of the people from the southern continents needing blankets to keep warm. Yesterday you will have noticed, as climate change experts in comma, we did bring sun to Vancouver. What I intend to do in the short time available is to, using Costa Rica specifically, Central America and the Andean countries as a spatial or territorial backdrop, reflect on some contextual, generic and specific aspects relating to the topic which brings us here today, which is primarily the adaptation to climate change problematic. Saying that, it is obviously important from the very beginning to accept that, as we know, climate change is with us. It has been with us for some time probably, and it will be with us in the future, probably under more exaggerated conditions. At the same time, the impact, the way it is felt, the way it is reacted to, and the opportunities to react to it vary according to context, territorial context, country, or continent. Consequently, to talk about adaptation and mitigation in the context of Canada, Vancouver, British Columbia is not the same as talking about these problems in the context of Central America and Andean countries, where whatever we're going to do and whatever we're able to do, how we look at the problem is inevitably coloured by notions of skewed development, poverty, which exceeds 60% on average throughout the region, large-scale environmental degradation as part of a development in commerce process over the last 50 years, and a series of other contexts in which adaptation has to take place or has to be supported and promoted. And so, basically, when I talk, I am talking from a southern perspective in the sense that adaptation has to be looked at principally in the framework of existing poverty conditions. And this does not, of course, deny the fact that Latin America has a very modern economy, modern infrastructure. It has 78% urban population in modern cities, but also crossed by the well-known phenomenon of poverty in rural and urban areas. Consequently, that is in some way a backdrop to what we're talking about adaptation and what the limits to it may be, or what the context in which it will take place is. If one looks and tries to depict what is the way in which climate change is expressed as a problem, there are a whole series of contexts which are typical to Costa Rica, typical to Central America, and many typical to the Andean countries. They include the problem of water availability for human and domestic and industrial use. In Costa Rica, very much so for the problem of energy generation, electricity generation, where 85% of the country's energy is generated by hydrological resources. There's a problem of biodiversity in a country where tourism is based on coastal resources and biodiversity as a tourist factor, along with what it plays in the whole equation of environmental management. There's a problem of health, where the increase in the potential for dengue, malaria, etc. is fairly strong. Coastal resources with high-scale advanced tourist development, etc., are significant points which should be looked at and which in fact do in many ways typify the problem in that country. If we go to the Andean countries, we inevitably have to add to this the problem of glacial melt. where the glaciers on volcanoes like Cotopaxi, Chimborazo in Ecuador, and in many other countries is disappearing at a very fast rate, and inevitably will affect water supply for large cities and for agricultural development in the country. Having said that, and recognizing there are a whole series of contexts and problems which exist, one also has to accept, and I think it's important to mention this, that in terms of a social image, the way in which society in Central America and Costa Rica constructs ideas around climate change and adaptation, it is not a very well set piece on the political agenda or in civil society. That does not mean to say that there is not attempts on the mitigation front, on the adaptation front, but faced with other more imposing daily, everyday challenges which go from free market and free trade agreements through to ongoing environmental degradation problems, water quality, the destruction of beaches and of coastal resources, there is a tendency to come to a conclusion that this is not a highly salient political problem still. And I think that is a major problem because it obviously has to become far more salient within the Costa Rican, the Central American and the Andean country situation. Still, probably mitigation, despite the fact that Latin America provides 6% of the carbon gases, mitigation is probably still a more important activity as promoted than adaptation. That has in fact led to a whole series of political discussions within the region on the nature of the use of biofuels, transgenic crops, and a series of other efforts which we don't have time to go into here. But there is a certain dissension on a local level with certain of the aspects related to the ways of dealing with mitigation. Adaptation, on the other hand, has not really got off the ground in terms of what we could call concrete, real actions. If we look at Costa Rica, for instance, since the first national communication in the early part of 2000 up to the third, which is where Costa Rica has got to, we have had a whole series of what are called vulnerability analyses related to sectors. The water sector, the hydro energy sector, the coastal sector, the tourism sector, the health sector. There are probably 8 or 9 of these that have been set together based on the use of socio-cultural, economic and hazard variables, looking at the situation today and projecting it to the future. There have been a limited number of strategic documents produced as regards sectors and where we should go with adaptation. But few of these have turned into real actions as such. There is one for the greater metropolitan area of San Jose, which is an area which houses 1,500,000 of the 4,500,000 people who live in Costa Rica, looking at water resources for development in the urban area. There is strategic efforts regarding such things as forest resources and ecological benefits to be derived, and persons and people using these resources, etc. And there are a limited number, and I say this intentionally, a limited number of studies that also lay out the problem from the perspective of what we could call a territorial perspective. That is, not looking at sectors as such, but looking at concrete human realities in territorial terms, localities, communities, crossing over sectors and looking at the notion, or this notion that is growing a good deal in Latin America today, of territorial security. But there again, if we look throughout Central America, the number of cases of this is relatively reduced. One problem which comes up, and it's worthwhile mentioning, is that a lot of people consider that basically we're not going anywhere because national governments, national society, civil society, not all of them, have not taken up on the problem and not willing to invest resources in it. And much of what is being done, in fact, relies on external funding and creates a dependency basis with such institutions as the Global Environmental Fund, and probably in the future with the Adaptation Fund once it is set up. And so there is a limitation of the amount that is done faced with other social problems. Sorry. Looking at from, and this will be my last point, looking at the problem from the angle of territorial security